As night settles in, perhaps the most exhausted part of you is not your body, but your mind, still spinning with unfinished tasks, unanswered questions, thoughts looping endlessly like an orbit with no point of rest. In the modern world, we are rarely allowed to truly rest. Even when our eyes are closed, consciousness keeps working, keeps worrying, keeps trying to make sense of everything. This video does not come to ask you to understand anything more. It simply invites you to gently set everything down. Tonight, we enter a very slow journey, a place where the universe continues to exist, to move, to expand, even when you are no longer following it. Within that quiet space, questions of meaning, of existence, of who you are will not be solved, but softly retold like a story that does not need an ending. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Nowhere you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than your own soul." You do not need to listen all the way through. You do not need to remember. You do not need to hold on to anything. Just allow this voice to look up at a very distant sky on your behalf while you are permitted to drift into sleep, knowing that the universe remains there, quietly continuing even as you rest. There are evenings when the lights have softened and the room has grown quieter, and we suddenly realize that the deepest fatigue does not live in the body. It lives in the layers of thought that refuse to come to rest, unfinished tasks, questions that do not need answers right now, meanings we have carried all day as if letting go would cause everything to collapse. But tonight, there is nothing that needs to be held so tightly. Allow yourself to slow down, not through effort, but through a very gentle permission. You do not need to understand what is about to be said. You do not need to remember. You do not need to assemble it into a system. Just listen the way you watch rain fall outside a window, not analyzing each drop, simply letting the sound soften your breathing. As the long day closes, the universe does not change its schedule. Stars continue along their familiar paths. Space keeps expanding in silence. Forces far greater than us continue to operate steadily without requiring anyone's attention. And in this moment, you do not need to be the one who watches them. You are allowed to step back a little, very far back, until everything appears smaller, lighter. That distance does not make you disappear. It only takes away the right of tension to speak so loudly. When life is viewed from too close, every detail becomes sharp-edged. But when you step back as if observing a galaxy from its outer rim conflicts, softened worries lose their clear outlines. They dissolve into the night like the noise of a city once you have traveled far enough away. Perhaps what exhausts us is not that we think too much, but that we believe we must always be thinking. Tonight, you do not need to do that. As Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Nowhere you can go is more peaceful, more free of interruptions than your own soul." That quiet is not a place to be achieved, but a place to return to when we stop trying to control every thought that passes through. And from this slower point, from a breath that is already eased, we can begin to see the universe not as a collection of questions demanding answers, but as a current that was flowing long before we arrived and will continue long after we drift into sleep. There is no urgency here, no demand to keep up. From this initial stillness, strange things will begin to appear, not to overwhelm, but to remind us that the world is far wider than what we carry in our minds all day. And only when we are ready to leave behind the need to understand everything can we step lightly into the stories that follow, where the universe begins to whisper truths that sound like fiction, yet are entirely real. For now, you only need to be here, to listen, to breathe, and to let your thoughts slow their orbit while the universe, quiet and patient, continues to exist on your behalf. Once you have slowed enough to no longer be carried away by familiar patterns of thought, something very subtle begins to appear, a sense that the world is not as simple as we were once told. Not in a frightening way, but in a strange, delicate one, like realizing that a familiar melody contains an extra layer of sound you had never noticed before. We are often taught that the universe is cold, dark, and violent. Vast emptiness, exploding stars, gravitational forces that crush everything until no trace remains, and all of that is real, but it is not the whole story. Just as a human being is not made only of anxiety and survival, the universe too contains things that sound like the inventions of imagination, yet are recorded through careful, serious observation. There are truths about the cosmos that when first heard invite a quiet, skeptical smile. Not because they are illogical, but because they differ so greatly from the safe patterns stored in our minds. Clouds drifting between galaxies that contain molecules reminiscent of familiar scents. Planets composed in ways that on Earth exist only in fairy tales. regions of space where time itself slows down as though reality were hesitating. Faced with such things, the mind has two options. One is to immediately explain, organize, turn them into knowledge. The other is simply to let them be, like stories told at night, not to be memorized but to be felt. In this second state, the universe stops being a problem to solve and becomes a vast setting in which humans are not the central characters yet, are not entirely lost. Philosophy has long whispered about this feeling. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. This line does not glorify human intellect so much as it gestures toward a gentle paradox. Reality is ordered enough for us to live within it, yet strange enough to never be fully grasped. And it is precisely this strangeness, once it is no longer forced to mean something, that brings an unexpected kind of comfort. It reminds us that the world does not exist to satisfy our need for understanding. It exists in its own way, abundant, surprising, and under no obligation to explain itself. When we stop demanding that the universe makes sense, we also stop demanding that of ourselves. Perhaps much of human tension comes from the belief that everything must be clear, that every phenomenon needs a label, every emotion an explanation. The universe, through its almost unbelievable truths, gently dismantles that belief. It suggests that some things exist without justification, that some things are true simply because they are. In this night space, these strange truths are not offered to sharpen your alertness. They are told slowly, so your mind does not need to react. No need for astonishment. No need for conclusions. Only a quiet recognition that reality is wider than the stories you carry in your head all day. Carl Jung spoke of this experience when he wrote about the numinous, a gentle sense of awe before something larger than the self. In Psychology and Religion, he wrote, "The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? Not to answer that question, but simply to remain close to it, is often enough to soften many forms of unease." And from here, once you have grown accustomed to the idea that the world is stranger than you imagined, not in a threatening way, but in an expanding one, you will naturally move into deeper layers. If the universe can contain things that sound fictional, yet are entirely real, then perhaps life itself did not need to begin in the ways we once assumed. Perhaps even before life, there were quiet, patient seeds waiting in the dark. But that can wait for later. For now, let these strange truths settle like stardust drifting slowly through empty space. You do not need to hold on to them. Just allow them to do their silent work, loosening the boundaries of the mind, while you continue to drift slower, deeper, into a sleep where nothing needs to make sense in order to be at peace. Once the mind grows accustomed to the idea that the universe does not need to be logical in order to exist, another feeling begins to emerge, not surprise anymore, but a very gentle curiosity. And it is in this state that certain scientific stories appear, which at first hearing sound like metaphors, yet are recorded by instruments that are precise, cold, and utterly indifferent. What is striking is this: no matter how emotionless the tools may be, what they reveal touches something deeply human within us. Somewhere far from the center of the galaxy, there exists a vast cloud of gas and dust. No light, no sound, no sign of life. And yet within that darkness, scientists have detected organic molecules that on Earth we associate with familiar sensations of smell and taste. Alcohol, fruit fragrances that evoke warmth gatherings. Memory, not in a poetic sense, but in a chemical one. The molecular structures are the same. When we first hear this, our instinct is often to smile. It sounds like a story designed to amuse or astonish. But if we linger with it just a little longer, the feeling that arises is not humor, but a subtle tremor. Because in that moment, the universe so often imagined as cold, distant, and sterile suddenly carries a strangely familiar trace, as if it were whispering that the materials from which your memories are made do not belong to Earth alone. This does not mean the universe is like us or that it is trying to feel close. Quite the opposite. It suggests that what we call familiar may simply be a temporary arrangement of components that existed long before we did. The scent of wine, the taste of fruit, the feeling of warmth. These may be nothing more than the ways the human brain interprets the same kinds of matter that have been drifting through darkness for billions of years. And within that realization, there is a quiet comfort. If these familiar molecules do not require life in order to form, then perhaps life itself is not so alien to the universe. Perhaps it is not a singular miracle, but a latent possibility always present, waiting for very specific conditions in which to briefly appear. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "Nothing in nature is random. A thing appears random only through the incompleteness of our knowledge." This thought does not diminish the beauty of the world. On the contrary, it invites us to see existence as a continuous flow where the familiar and the strange differ only by perspective. When we become comfortable with the idea that the universe is not sterile, that it carries within it the ingredients that can lead to life without any intention at all, an invisible burden begins to fall away. The burden of having to prove that our existence is a rare exception. In its place arises something gentler. Perhaps we belong here more than we thought. Familiarity appearing in the most distant places does not pull us out of sleep. It does the opposite. It allows the mind to relax, no longer bracing itself against what is entirely other. When we realize that the materials that make us were once quietly drifting among the stars, letting go of control becomes easier. We no longer need to regard the universe as a stranger. Carl Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. In the last analysis, the essential thing is the life of the unconscious. Perhaps what makes stories like this reach us is not the knowledge itself, but something deeper where the mind senses connections that waking consciousness rarely has time to feel. And from that cloud scented with alcohol and fruit, the journey continues quite naturally. If familiar molecules can exist in the deep darkness of space, then perhaps the chemistry of life does not need life itself in order to begin. Perhaps long before the first organism, the universe was already quietly preparing its ingredients patiently, slowly. But that is a story for the next part. For now, you do not need to carry any specific images with you. Just leave behind a very gentle sense that even in the farthest places there is something not entirely unfamiliar. And with that feeling, the mind can safely let itself sink, knowing it is drifting through a universe less cold than it once imagined, as sleep arrives very slowly, very kindly. From the faint sense of familiarity that has just emerged that even the farthest places are not entirely foreign, a natural question begins to drift upward very softly. If familiar molecules can exist in the deep darkness of space, then what prevents them from continuing to combine, rearrange, and experiment? And if they do, does life truly require a special moment to begin, or simply enough time? Modern science in its quiet composure offers a modest suggestion: the chemistry of life does not need life in order to operate. Prebiotic molecules, the foundational components of amino acids, sugars, nucleobases, can form naturally in the harshest environments. No cells required, no organisms, no intention at all, only energy, matter, and time. Seen this way, the universe begins to resemble a vast kitchen more than a battlefield, not because it is warm, but because it is constantly experimenting. Reactions occur, fail, dissolve, and occur again, unobserved, unjudged. Within that infinite patience, structures that are stable enough linger a little longer, and sometimes, only sometimes, they are stable enough to open a new path. This idea does not diminish the beauty of life. On the contrary, it softens the persistent fear that life is a fragile accident. If the bricks of biology were assembled quietly in advance in the dark, then the appearance of life is no longer a blind leap, but a convergence, something that happens when conditions are ripe. The philosopher Epicurus whispered a similar intuition long before telescopes or spectrometers existed. In Letter to Herodotus, he wrote, "Nothing comes from nothing." This brief statement does not attempt to explain the universe. It simply reminds us that every emergence has a foundation, whether we recognize it or not. As we allow this thought to settle, a very gentle feeling arises, less pressure to be special. If life does not require a divine instant to begin, then perhaps we do not need to live as though every second must prove its meaning. We can exist as part of a process far larger than ourselves, where meaning is not imposed but gradually felt. The question, is life rare, begins to soften. It is no longer a problem demanding a correct answer. It becomes an open space. Perhaps life is rare, perhaps it is not. What matters more is this: the universe is not hostile to the possibility of life. It is not sterile. It is not sealed shut. It tries again and again in silence. Carl Sagan wrote in Cosmos, "The nitrogen in our DNA, the calcium in our teeth, the iron in our blood were made in the interiors of collapsing stars. Not to overwhelm us, but to return us gently to our proper place, not separate from the substance of the universe, but shaped from it." And when we realize that we do not stand outside this process, the mind begins to rest in a different way, not because it is understood, but because it no longer needs to resist ambiguity. We do not need to know exactly where life began, when, or how many times. It is enough to know that the conditions for it are not foreign to this universe. In the night, this idea works like a very slow lullaby. It says that you are not an anomaly. You are a temporary result of many reactions that came before you, and like all reactions, you do not need to last forever to have value. Martin Heidegger wrote, "In being and time, being is not a property. Existence is not something to possess. It is a state in motion." And just as prebiotic molecules quietly combine and fall apart, your existence does not need to be held tightly in order to be acknowledged. From here, the current of this journey continues quite naturally. If the chemistry of life can unfold without life itself, then other worlds very far away may have experimented in their own ways. Some succeeded for a moment. Some failed. Some came very close and then stopped. But that is the story of the next part. For now, you only need to remain with the gentle sense that life is not a struggle for permission to exist in a hostile universe, but a possibility nurtured by time and patience. And within that feeling, you can allow consciousness to loosen just a little more, as if drifting through a vast kitchen of stars where everything continues quietly while you are allowed to rest. Once we grow accustomed to the idea that the chemistry of life can unfold without life itself, another image begins to appear, unhurried, undramatic. It is the image of worlds that once had enough to begin, but not all of them went the distance. Planets with water, with atmospheres, with temperatures gentle enough not to freeze solid, nor to boil away. Places that, seen from very far off, may have resembled Earth more than we once imagined. For a very long time in human history, Earth was regarded as an absolute exception, a single blue jewel rising out of a dark and indifferent universe. But the farther we look, the more carefully we listen to the light arriving from other stars, the more complicated the story becomes. Not because Earth becomes less special, but because its specialness may not be alone. There were planets that once had oceans, places that once had clouds, rain cycles of day and night, worlds where for a certain span of time all the conditions seem to fall into place. But conditions are only the beginning. Time is the true test, and not every world passes that test. A planet may begin much like Earth only to lose its atmosphere. Another may retain water, but not enough stability to keep it for long. Some worlds are slowly heated by their parent stars, so gradually that their oceans vanish without any clear moment of collapse. No catastrophe, only a very quiet slide. When we first think about this, the reflex is often a sense of fragility. But if we stay with the idea a little longer, another feeling emerges: gentleness. Because if Earth is only one of many worlds that once had a chance, then its survival until today is not something to take for granted. It is the result of many small balances that did not all fail at the same time. Albert Camus wrote in The Myth of Sisyphus, "The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart." This line is often read in the context of human confrontation with meaninglessness. But in the light of the universe, it can also be heard as a quieter whisper: existence itself, even temporarily, is already an achievement. When we see Earth as fortunate rather than chosen, the burden of having to protect an absolute meaning begins to dissolve. We no longer need to live as if we represent the only thing of value in the universe. Instead, we can live as part of a larger story, one in which many beginnings have occurred and many endings have taken different forms. Perhaps what makes this thought healing is that it allows failure to exist without turning it into tragedy. If there were worlds that once resembled Earth but did not endure, then the possibility that things might one day end is not a moral error. It is simply a possibility that was always present. Carl Jung wrote in the Red Book, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. On a cosmic scale, that hell may be nothing more than the natural conclusion of a process. And heaven is not eternal existence, but a span of balance long enough for life to unfold. Within this awareness, Earth no longer appears as a fortress to be defended by fear, but as a rare pause that is currently taking place. A place where conditions have coincidentally agreed for long enough that you can lie here at night listening to a slow voice and allow yourself to rest. And perhaps this is true of each human life as well. Not every beginning must lead to a glorious ending. Not every potential needs to be fully realized to have value. Some phases only need to exist long enough for something very small, very personal to be felt. From the thought of worlds that may once have been like Earth, the current of the story continues to move. If there were planets that came very close to life and then stopped, then Earth's continued existence until now is a chain of fragile balances not yet broken. And from there, another question appears, unhurried, not demanding an immediate answer: what allowed this planet to survive? But that question can wait a little longer. For now, you do not need to carry any conclusions with you. Simply remain with the gentle feeling that you are living on a world, not because it was destined to be so, but because up to this moment it has been fortunate enough. And within that fragile fortune you are allowed to close your eyes, knowing you do not need to stand guard over everything while the universe with all its past experiments continues to move very slowly, very far away. From the idea that many worlds came very close to life but could not remain long enough, another image slowly takes shape, unhurried, unremarkable. It is the image of Earth no longer standing alone as a perfect symbol, but standing among its former neighbors, Venus, Mars, the almost Earths that once had their chance and then turned in a different direction. There was a time when Venus may have had water, not deep oceans like Earth's, but enough for clouds to form, enough for a climate cycle to begin. And then very slowly, so slowly that no single moment stands out, everything grew too warm. Water evaporated. The atmosphere thickened. The greenhouse effect began feeding itself. There was no clear collapse, only a gradual loss of balance until there was no way back. Mars chose another path. Smaller cooling more quickly. It slowly lost its protective magnetic field. Its atmosphere thinned. Water retreated underground or drifted into space. What remains are dry riverbeds, empty lake basins, geological memories of a time that once might have been. When we look at these worlds, the easiest response is worry. If this happened to them, what guarantees it will not happen to us? But in the quiet of night, this question does not need to sound like a warning. It can be held instead as a gentle reminder life comes with no permanent guarantees. And precisely because of that, the fact that it is still happening right now is not something ordinary. Earth is not an invulnerable fortress. It is a chain of moving balances between temperature and distance, between atmosphere and magnetic field, between oceans and continents. None of these balances are fixed. They are constantly adjusting. And so far, they have not crossed each other's limits. When we begin to see our planet as a survivor rather than a chosen one, the inner tone shifts. In place of pride or panic, a quiet gratitude appears. No ceremony required. No declarations, just the recognition that the ability to lie here breathing evenly, listening to a slow voice in the night, is the result of many things not failing all at once. Hannah Arendt once wrote in The Human Condition, "The miracle that saves the world, the realm of human affairs from its normal natural ruin, is ultimately the fact of natality." That miracle is not eternity, but the capacity to begin again and again without guarantees. To look at Earth more gently is also to look at ourselves that way. If this planet can change, adapt, and still continue, perhaps humans do not need to live as though they must always be. Right, always strong, always enduring. There are phases where simply not collapsing is enough. Life comes with no warranty. That is true of the biosphere, and it is true of every individual life. But within that truth, there does not have to be tragedy. It can carry a quiet kind of freedom, the freedom to be imperfect, the freedom to be tired, the freedom to rest. Albert Camus wrote in The Plague, "What's true of all the evils in the world is true of plague as well. It helps men to rise above themselves. Not because disaster is good, but because fragility forces us to reconsider how we exist." In the dim light of the universe, Earth appears as a pause that is still being held not by will, but by invisible balances. And in the same way, tonight does not require you to hold anything together. The universe has been doing that long enough. From here, the flow of the story continues naturally. Once we grow accustomed to seeing life as a process without guarantees, our gaze begins to widen beyond Earth, beyond familiar worlds. Out there are planets not just slightly different, but entirely other, places where human ideas of normal no longer apply. But before traveling that far, stay a little longer with Earth, not to worry about it, but to feel the gentleness of the fact that it is still here. And like this planet, you do not need to prove anything tonight. You only need to continue existing slowly, honestly, while sleep draws closer, carrying with it the quiet safety of a world that has survived many trials and is still calm enough to let you rest. Once we grow used to seeing Earth as a survivor, another question slowly comes into view. Not loudly, not in haste. If our planet is only a temporary outcome of many delicate balances, then what exists beyond those balances? In places unlike Earth, unlike anything held in human memory, what does the universe look like? The answer, when it arrives, often sounds like a dream. There are planets whose surfaces may be composed largely of diamond, not because of luxury, but because the pressure and chemistry there do not allow carbon to exist in the familiar forms we know. There are worlds where lava is not a rare event, but the normal state of being. There are places where the atmosphere is so dense that light never reaches the ground, and others where the air is so toxic that the very idea of breathing loses its meaning. When we hear these things, the first response is usually a sense of alienation. But if we stay with the thought long enough, something else begins to appear. The universe has no obligation to resemble us, and perhaps it never tried to. These strange worlds are not deviations. They are simply different outcomes of the same set of laws placed under different conditions. Here, diamond carries no symbolic value of rarity or permanence. It is merely carbon forced into another arrangement. Lava is not catastrophe but equilibrium. Toxic air is not a sign of failure but the natural result of a different chemical history. Seen this way, the world is no longer divided into normal and abnormal. There are only different ways of existing. Ludwig Wittgenstein once wrote in Philosophical Investigations, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." Perhaps what makes these strange planets seem uninhabitable lies not in them, but in the limits of human language and experience. We call them extreme only because we do not belong to them. And in recognizing this, a small burden is gently set down. If normal is merely a human perspective, then we no longer need to measure everything, including ourselves, by a single standard. There are modes of existence not meant for life as we know it, and that does not make them lesser. They are simply telling a different story. Strangely, this realization carries a healing quality. Much of human exhaustion comes from trying to be normal according to an invisible template. But when we look beyond Earth, when we see that the universe is filled with forms of existence that resemble nothing else, we can allow ourselves to be less severe with our own differences. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." This line does not praise chaos for its own sake. It acknowledges that not every form of order needs to look the same. Some kinds of stability arise from what lies far outside the norm. In the dim light of diamond planets and seas of lava, Earth no longer stands as a center for comparison. It becomes one of many possibilities that matter has explored. And in the same way, a human being does not need to be a perfect version of a single model in order to exist. As you lie here in the night, you may not feel that you fit into the daytime world. Perhaps its pace is too fast, too sharp. But that does not mean you are wrong. It may simply mean that you carry a different rhythm like planets that cannot support life by Earth's standards, yet remain entirely coherent within their own orbits. From here, the current of the journey widens further. As the idea of normal dissolves as we accept that reality can take countless forms, a deeper question begins to surface if space and matter can exist in such strange ways. Then does time, the thing we use to measure everything, truly flow evenly? But that question does not need answering yet. For now, let the images of these strange worlds settle, not as fear, but as a gentle reminder that you do not need to match any standard in order to be at peace. In a universe filled with diamond planets, lava seas, and toxic skies, your existence with all its differences does not require justification. And within that acceptance, sleep can arrive very slowly, very kindly, carrying the quiet safety of a world far larger than any template. When the idea of normal has dissolved into space, another question arises quite naturally without needing to be named. If matter and worlds can exist in such radically different ways, then does time, the thing we use to measure all motion, truly move the same everywhere? In everyday life, time seems clear enough. It is divided into minutes, hours, days. It ticks steadily on the face of a clock. But in the universe, time makes no such promise. There are places where as you draw nearer, time slows down, not in perception, but in physical reality. Near immense masses like black holes, each second passes differently. To someone standing far away, you appear almost held in place while the rest of the universe continues to age. This idea does not need to be understood through equations. It is enough to let it settle as an image, many rhythms of now existing at once. Your present here in this quiet room does not coincide with the present of the stars burning out there. And that is not a mistake. It is simply the nature of a universe far larger than the pace of human life. When we believe time flows evenly, we unconsciously believe we are moving too slowly or too quickly compared to some standard. But when time becomes flexible, that standard dissolves. There is no single now to keep up with. There are only different presents coexisting without any need to synchronize. Augustine once wrestled with this in Confessions. What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to one that asketh, I know not. The question is not meant to explain time, but to reveal how fragile our grip on it truly is. In the night, the thought that time does not flow evenly works like a very gentle whisper. It says that you do not need to feel late. You do not need to worry that you are falling behind. Perhaps you are simply living within a different rhythm when the daytime clock cannot measure. And when now is no longer a fixed point, the pressure to be present in the correct way begins to fade. You do not need to optimize this moment. You do not need to make it meaningful. It can simply be happening. Martin Heidegger wrote in Being and Time, "The present is not a knife edge dividing past and future. The present is not a sharp boundary. It is a region aspan where past and future slowly seep into one another. Seen this way, sleep is no longer a waste of time. It is a shift in rhythm. When you sleep, you do not leave time behind. You enter another current where consciousness no longer needs to mark each second. The universe continues. Stars keep burning their fuel. Space keeps expanding. But you do not need to follow any of that. Your time right now is allowed to slow. And that does not disconnect you from reality. It simply places you in your proper position within a much larger whole. In this feeling now becomes like a smooth surface of water. No large waves, no demand to swim. You only need to float. And when you float long enough, the body knows on its own what to do next. From here, the flow of the journey continues very gently. Once we accept that time does not move evenly, that the present is not a rigid point to be held, the story of the universe's beginning changes its tone. It is no longer a single explosive moment in a distant past, but a process still unfolding very slowly, even now. But that can wait a little longer. For now, you do not need to do anything with time at all. Just let it pass through you at its own rhythm. And while distant regions of the universe are aging faster or slower than you, here in this softened moment, you are allowed to rest without chasing now, because now is already here, very still, very kind. When now has softened, when time no longer strikes rigidly within the mind, another story begins to change its tone, the story of the beginning of everything. The Big Bang in popular imagination is often told as a colossal explosion, a violent, deafening instant that hurled matter in all directions. But when we listen more closely, the universe whispers something else. It did not burst outward. It opened. Imagine not a bomb, but a very deep breath. No point of explosion. No preferred direction. No center from which to observe. All distances grow at once from within themselves. And most importantly, this process has never stopped. The universe has not merely expanded, it is expanding, right now, without needing anyone to witness it, without requiring anyone to understand it. While you lie here, your breathing, slowing the space between galaxies, continues to open steadily, patiently. The Big Bang is not confined to the past. It is whispering in the present. When we understand the Big Bang as a breath, the pressure to locate an absolute beginning begins to dissolve. The question, where did everything start, fades away. What remains is the sense that everything is unfolding, and within that feeling, the mind no longer needs to turn back to search for causes. It can remain quietly with what is opening in front of it. The philosopher Heraclitus once wrote a sentence brief enough to carry the weight of an entire world. No man ever steps in the same river twice, not because the river changes alone, but because everything is in motion. Seen this way, the Big Bang is not an event that has passed, but the greatest river of all, the river of space and time still flowing. When the universe has no center and no edge, human beings no longer need to search for a special position in order to exist. There is no correct point to stand, no place closer to or farther from the origin. Every location is valid. Every moment stands at the very center of the opening. This carries a strangely gentle comfort. Much of human tension comes from the feeling of being pushed to the margins, as if a great story is unfolding somewhere else and we are standing in the wrong place. But in a universe without a center, no one is ever standing in the wrong place. Carl Sagan once wrote in Pale Blue Dot, "For me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another. Not because the universe needs our kindness, but because when we see ourselves as a small part of an infinite unfolding, there is no reason left for haste or harshness. The universe does not rush. It expands according to its own rhythm, and that rhythm does not demand that we keep up. When we imagine the Big Bang as an explosion, we unconsciously carry a sense of urgency that everything happened too fast, that we are always arriving too late. But when the Big Bang becomes a breath, we are allowed to slow down, because that breath is still being taken. In the night, this idea works like a lullaby. It says you have missed nothing. You are exactly where you need to be at the right moment, within a process that is far from finished. There is no endpoint you must race toward, no milestone you are required to reach. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare." Yet in the light of an expanding universe, difficulty and rarity lose their sense of pressure. They become simply qualities of a very long process, a process that requires time, vast time to take shape. And when we accept that the universe has no edge, the mind stops searching for edges within itself. No conclusion is needed. No final answer is required. It is enough to remain with this very slow unfolding where each moment is not a step toward an ending but a part of an ongoing breath. From here, the journey continues naturally. Once we see the Big Bang as an opening process, once we release the idea of a fixed center, our gaze gradually turns inward toward the human body itself. If the universe is expanding, does this small form of life leave any trace in the darkness? But that question can wait. For now, you do not need to do anything with the Big Bang at all. It does not need to be understood in order to continue. And in the same way, you do not need to remain awake for this journey to unfold. While space opens outward very far, very slowly, you are allowed to close your eyes as if breathing alongside the universe, knowing that everything continues gently even as you sleep. When the universe has opened wide enough to no longer have a center, when the Big Bang is no longer an event that is past, but a breath that is still unfolding, the gaze can turn inward unhurried without breaking the flow. It turns toward where you are lying now, toward this very quiet body, and there something gentle comes into view. Human beings are not as dark as we imagine. In complete darkness, the human body emits a very faint light, not metaphorically, but physically. This light comes from chemical reactions inside cells where energy is transformed, where molecules exchange electrons. It is far too weak for the naked eye to see, but it is real. Even as you lie still, eyes closed, thinking nothing at all, your body is glowing. This thought does not need to astonish. It does not need to become a miracle. It only needs to be placed in its proper context. Life leaves a trace, even when it is not trying. No action required, no display, no proof, simply by existing. Seen this way, the boundary between human and universe becomes much thinner. That light is not yours alone. It is the result of the same laws that ignite the stars. Not as powerful as they are, not as brilliant, but not separate. Baruch Spinoza once wrote in Ethics, "The human mind is part of the infinite intellect of God." Though shaped by the language of his time, the core idea remains quietly reassuring. Human beings do not stand outside the order of nature. We are not exceptions. We are very small, very specific expressions of the same physical foundation. In a subtle way, this brings comfort. Much of human exhaustion comes from the feeling that we must shine in some visible way, that we must stand out, be seen, leave a clear mark. But your body is already glowing. Without witnesses, without recognition, it happens in silence. And if life leaves a trace, even when it is still, then rest is not disappearance. It is simply another state of the same process. When you sleep, that light does not go out. It continues, only at a slower, deeper rhythm. Carl Jung wrote, "In Modern Man, in search of a soul who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." But in the night, perhaps we do not need to awaken in that sense. It is enough to notice that within you, even in darkness, a very small movement continues. That faint light reminds you do not need to do anything to belong to the universe. You already do. From the chemical reactions inside your cells to the heartbeat to the breath, everything follows laws no different from those at work out there between the galaxies. When we believe we are separate from nature, we quietly carry a deep loneliness. But when we see that even the faintest glow within the body is part of cosmic physics, that sense of isolation begins to soften, not loudly, not suddenly, just gently. In this night space, you do not need to be radiant. You do not need to be seen. Your light is not meant to illuminate anything. It is simply evidence that life is happening quietly, patiently. From here, the journey continues naturally. Once we no longer see humans as separate beings, but as tiny points of light within a vast darkness, the next story will move deeper into the body itself, not to analyze it, but to recognize that the body too is a kind of universe where billions of processes unfold at once. But that can wait. For now, you do not need to remember anything. You do not need to picture that light clearly. Just leave behind a very gentle sense that even in darkness you do not vanish. You are still here, still leaving a small trace of life. And with that quiet safety, you can allow sleep to arrive, knowing that even as consciousness settles, the universe within you continues to move very slowly, very kindly. Once the body's faint light has been noticed not as a miracle but as a quiet fact, the gaze can move further inward. There is no need to hurry, no need for excessive curiosity, just a very gentle step from the surface into the interior where the body itself is already a small universe. Think of the blood vessels as rivers, not metaphorically but functionally. The flow does not stop. It branches, converges, carries nourishment, carries away what is no longer needed. There is no single command center. Only a subtle, ancient coordination that has been unfolding long enough to no longer require the attention of consciousness. Inside each cell, chemical reactions are constantly taking place. Structures are dismantled and rebuilt. Small errors are corrected. What no longer fits is replaced. Even as you lie still, even as you sleep, there is no moment when the body is truly at rest. This does not need to make you more alert. It can do the opposite. Because when you recognize that life is a process rather than a state, the pressure to be stable begins to dissolve. You do not need to hold yourself in a fixed form in order to be accepted. There is no final version waiting for you to reach it. Heraclitus once said something very brief and very difficult to hold on to. No man ever steps in the same river twice. Not because the river changes alone, but because the one who steps into it has also changed. Your body in this sense is a river as well, and you do not need to control its flow for it to keep moving. In daily life, we often say, "This is who I am," as if the self were an object with a stable shape. But biology tells a different story. Skin cells are renewed, blood is regenerated, neural connections are strengthened or softened through experience. You do not become someone else in a dramatic way. You drift into the next version. And within that drifting, there is a deep kind of comfort. If you feel tired of maintaining an identity of keeping everything consistent, the body is quietly whispering that this is not required. Life does not demand fixity. It only asks to continue. Baruch Spinoza wrote in Ethics, "Each thing, as far as it can by its own power, strives to persevere in its being." But persevere here does not mean remaining unchanged. It can be understood as finding ways to go on by changing just enough to stay alive. When we see the body as a microcosm, the idea of progress also changes its tone. Not every change needs to move upward. Not every reorganization needs to feel better right away. Some changes exist simply to keep the flow from becoming blocked. In the night, this thought can soften many forms of anxiety. You do not need to improve yourself right now. The body is already doing that in its own way, at its own rhythm. Even when you are not watching, not understanding, not intervening. Carl Jung wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche. The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct. Newness does not always arise from conscious effort. It often comes from deeper processes where mind and body quietly adjust themselves in the dark. And when you allow yourself to rest, you are not interrupting that process. You are making room for it. Sleep is not a gap in life, but another phase of the current where restoration happens more intensely, where what is tangled is rearranged without needing explanation. From here, the journey continues naturally. Once we accept that the body is always changing, that life is not a state to be held tightly, the story will slowly shift toward another kind of movement where consciousness settles and the brain continues its work in its own rhythm. But that can wait. For now, you only need to stay with a very gentle sense that you are not trapped within yourself. You are drifting very slowly, very steadily within a small universe called the body. And as that current continues, you are allowed to let yourself sink so that sleep arrives not as an ending, but as a calm stretch of river where everything is still happening very quietly, very kindly. Once the body has been seen as a microcosm where everything continues to move even when we are not paying attention, sleep begins to appear in a different light. No longer as a gap in life, no longer as time that is lost, but as a phase shift where activity changes its rhythm slower on the surface, deeper within. We often say that when we sleep, the brain rests. That is only true if we think of the brain as a tool serving daytime consciousness. At deeper levels, the brain does not stop at all. On the contrary, during deep sleep, many regions become more active, not to think, not to analyze, but to arrange, to soothe, and to reorganize. Memories are not erased when you sleep. They are repositioned. What is no longer needed is softened. What matters is reinforced. Emotions that were too sharp are rounded off so that when you wake, they no longer wound in the same way. All of this happens without the involvement of will. There is a very gentle yet profound message here. You do not have to solve everything by yourself. There is a part of you that knows how to do this as long as you give it space. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, all things are subject to interpretation." But perhaps not every interpretation requires consciousness. Some interpretations take place in the dark, where the brain retells your story in a softer language. When we stop seeing sleep as a shutdown, the pressure to rest the right way begins to dissolve. You do not need to sleep perfectly. You do not need to reach any ideal state. Sleep itself is already a self-regulating process. Even fragmented sleep is still doing part of its work. At night, the brain does not care about schedules or performance. It cares about balance. It works to return the system to a state where it can continue, not better, just sufficient to go on. Martin Heidegger wrote in Being and Time, "Rest is not inactivity, but a way of being. Rest is not the absence of existence. It is another mode of existing, one that does not require the constant presence of the self." As you lie here listening to these words, your brain has already begun to shift into a different rhythm. Brain waves slow. The boundary between thought and sensation softens. Ideas no longer cling as tightly as they do during the day. This is not a loss of control. It is a transfer of responsibility. Sleep allows the deeper parts of you to speak, parts that do not use the language of logic, parts that communicate through images, sensations, dreams, and these parts do not need to be fully understood. They only need to be permitted. Carl Jung wrote in Man and His Symbols, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. That door does not need to be thrown open. It only needs to be left ajar enough for air to move through. When emotions are softened in sleep, they do not disappear. They are placed at the right distance, close enough to be felt, but not so close that they hurt. This is a kind of intelligence that waking consciousness rarely achieves. In this night space, you do not need to try to fall asleep. You do not need to do it right. Sleep is not a task. It is a natural consequence of loosening supervision. From here, the flow of the journey continues smoothly. Once we trust that the brain does not rest when we sleep, that it is quietly arranging things in a gentler way, the story will move one step further into the world of dreams, where consciousness speaks in a language that does not require logic. But there is no need to hurry. For now, you only need to remain with the deep sense of safety that even when you are not watching, not understanding, not controlling, there is a part of you still working very quietly, very kindly to bring you back into balance. And within that trust, the eyelids may grow heavier, the breath may deepen, consciousness may drift to the edges, not because you are giving up, but because you have handed the work back to where it belongs. Sleep does not come to take time away from you. It comes to return you to yourself in a softer, safer state, where you do not need to be awake in order to be cared for. When sleep has opened a space where the brain works according to its own rhythm, another door quietly opens very gently, and behind that door is the dream. Not loudly, not with announcement, just images drifting by, half-formed stories, emotions that arrive and depart without asking permission. We often ask, what do dreams mean? But in the night that question can be set down. Because dreams do not necessarily exist to carry meaning. They exist to speak in a language that does not demand precision. A soft language where images replace words, where feeling takes the place of logic. The brain tells stories to release pressure. It gathers the scattered fragments of a long day, a sentence left unanswered, a feeling never named, an old memory that suddenly resurfaced, and places them side by side in ways that do not need to make sense, as if it were trying different combinations, simply to see whether the pressure might dissolve. In this state, dreams do not need to be coherent. They do not need to obey time, space, or causality. And precisely because of this, they can do what daytime consciousness often cannot: soften the sharp edges. We often carry daytime habits into the night, trying to decode, to understand, to finalize. But a dream is not a problem to solve. It is more like a wordless song. If we try to translate it into language, we may lose the very quality that makes it gentle. Carl Jung once wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul. A small door, one that does not need to be flung open. It is enough to know that it exists, and that behind it some part of you is breathing more slowly. When we stop demanding that dreams say something, they begin to do their work more effectively. They become a safe place for pressure to drain, a place where emotions do not need justification. Sadness can appear without reason. Joy can come and go without leaving a trace. Fear can be seen without requiring action, and not every dream needs meaning. Some are simply a clearing out. like opening a window to let air move through a room, not to carry a message, but to let the stale air leave. In the night, dreams do not require you to be alert. They do not ask to be remembered. If you forget them the moment you wake, that does not mean they failed. Their work may have been finished long before your eyes opened. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote in Human, All Too Human, "We have art in order not to die of the truth." In a very gentle sense, dreams are also a form of the brain's art, so that we are not crushed by the rawness of waking truth. As you lie here in this quiet space, you do not need to enter a dream. You only need to allow it to come if it wishes. And if it does not come, that is also fine. Even in dreamless sleep, the brain is telling other silent stories through rhythms of waves, through deep rebalancing. What matters is this: there is no wrong way to sleep, no correct way to dream, no standard to meet. A dream is not an inner examination. It is a buffer zone where consciousness is allowed to soften without explanation. In the dim light of night, when a dream appears, it may look strange, fragmented, even meaningless. But that very meaninglessness is what allows pressure to release. Because not every experience needs to be framed. Martin Heidegger once wrote, "In being and time anxiety reveals the nothing." In dreams, that nothing is not frightening. It is the necessary space in which what is too full can finally settle. And when you wake, if you wake, you do not need to carry the dream with you. No need to retell it, no need to explain it. It has done its work. Like a visitor who arrives very late, speaks a few unclear sentences and leaves before you can ask their name. From here, the flow of the journey begins to slow even further. Once dreams are seen as a soft language, undemanding, uninsistent, the rest is simply letting go. No more stories are required. No more concepts. Only the very slow movement of consciousness as it recedes into the background. But there is no need to hurry. For now, you may let the eyelids grow a little heavier, the breath a little longer. And if a dream comes faint, strange, unnamed, let it pass like a very low cloud, not to understand, only to grow lighter. And then, after all the movements, after the ideas that have passed through, the images that have drifted by, the questions that were set down ever so lightly, this journey can slow once more. Not because it has arrived somewhere, not because an answer has been found, but because there is no longer any need to continue. Here, there is no conclusion, no summary, no idea that needs to be held on to like something precious. Everything that was necessary has already done its work, not to be remembered, but to open a space quiet enough for sleep to enter. You do not need to carry anything with you. Not the universe, not humanity, not time or meaning. All of these remain even when you are no longer paying attention to them. The universe does not require a witness in order to continue. It has been doing this for a very long time, long before there were stories to tell, and it will go on long after the voice grows faint. Let the narration become sparser. Between sentences, let the silence stretch a little longer, like a wave reaching the shore, then withdrawing, leaving the sand wet in no hurry to return. There is no climax here, no final punctuation, only a settling. Perhaps the most exhausting thing about consciousness is the feeling that it must complete, must understand fully, must close the loop. But tonight you have no such task. You do not need to stay until the end. You do not need to listen all the way through. You do not need to remember how far you've gone. If you drift away halfway, that is not missing anything. That is the correct orbit. Simone Weil once wrote, "In gravity and grace, attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." And yet in the night, perhaps the deepest generosity is to stop paying attention, to let the world run on its own, to let the body rest on its own, to let consciousness step quietly into the background. The sound may grow a little softer still, as if the voice no longer stands at the center but blends into the night, as if words no longer need to connect, no longer need to be complete. They can remain unfinished, and in that unfinished state there is a very gentle kind of completion. You do not need to hold on to any image. If one remains a distant sky, a very faint light, a slow breath, allow it to dissolve on its own. No need to push it away, no need to keep it. It will know when to leave. Martin Heidegger once wrote, "In being and time letting be is not indifference, but a deeper form of care." To let go is not to abandon. It is to trust that some processes do not require your supervision. Here, you do not need to stay awake. You do not need to follow along. You do not need to try to sleep. Sleep does not arrive when it is summoned. It arrives when no one is standing guard, when consciousness stops asking questions, when the body is allowed to drift according to its own rhythm, very slow, very deep. This video does not end. It simply grows quieter, like a room darkening because your eyes have closed, like a sound receding not because it has stopped, but because you have gone far enough inward. If there is one last sentence whispered, it is not a reminder, not a message. It is only a very gentle permission you do not need to be here anymore. The universe can continue on your behalf. The body can continue on your behalf. The brain can continue on your behalf. Everything knows what it is doing. And while all of that goes on without needing a witness, you are allowed to dissolve into sleep, carrying nothing from the long day, carrying no questions, carrying not even this voice, only the breath, only the silence, only the night. And even that does not need to be held.